The day my HOA president tried to pour concrete into a historic root cellar and charged me $5,000 for the privilege, I learned two things. First, suburban tyranny really does come in a pink tracksuit, and second, some people will absolutely commit a federal crime just to make a yard look more beige. Yeah, that happened. And if you've ever wondered how far a tiny taste of power can rot a person from the inside out, let me tell you about Karen Miller. She showed up on a hot, sticky Virginia afternoon, standing right at the edge of my property like the grass might stain her white sneakers, clipboard tucked under her arm, like she was carrying the 10 Commandments down from some gated community mountaintop. Karen was the president of the Meadows at Liberty Crossing Homeowners Association, a woman in her late 50s with the build of a retired linebacker and the attitude of somebody who thought God had personally appointed her to police mulch colors. She pointed one manicured finger at the stone-lined entrance to my root cellar and said, in that syrupy, cruel little voice some people use when they enjoy being awful, "Your little dirt hole is a public nuisance and a structural liability. Mr. Caldwell, we're having it filled with concrete by Friday, and the $5,000 special assessment will be added to your dues." Now let me back up a sec. That little dirt hole had been there for well over 100 years, tucked into the slope behind my grandfather's farmhouse, right beside the old barn and the smokehouse. I inherited the place after he passed, bought out my sister's share, and moved back for good after 22 years in the Army Corps of Engineers. Master Sergeant Mark Caldwell, retired. I'd spent half my adult life building bases in war zones, solving problems under pressure, keeping people alive with discipline, structure, and a little bit of controlled stubbornness. Coming home to 5 acres of rolling Virginia land felt like being able to exhale for the first time in years. The farmhouse was sturdy, the outbuildings were old but honest, and that cellar, cool, dark, built from fieldstone and oak, was part of the heartbeat of the place. My grandfather loved that land in the quiet, work-worn way men like him love things. He didn't give speeches. He taught by doing. He taught me how to mend fence, how to read the weather in the wind, how to stack a pantry for winter, how to leave something better than you found it. After Afghanistan, when my head was still full of noise I couldn't quite turn off, the work out there helped. The dirt helped. The silence helped. On that land, I wasn't responsible for anyone's life. I was just Mark again. Problem was, over the years, suburbia had metastasized around the property like vinyl-sided mold. My 5 acres had been grandfathered in when Liberty Crossing got built, so I wasn't technically a regular HOA member, but because my property bordered their precious development, some bizarre county clause gave them oversight on exterior structures. I found that out the hard way when Karen tried to stop me from repainting my barn its original historic red because, according to her, beige would be more harmonious with the surrounding homes. Beige. For a century-old barn. That should tell you everything you need to know about the woman. I won that fight, barely, with a letter from the Historical Society and enough grit to outlast her. Ever since then, she'd had me in her sights. She looked at my land and didn't see history, character, or craftsmanship. She saw noncompliance. She saw something she couldn't control. And people like Karen can live with a lot of things, noise, hypocrisy, corruption, but they cannot live with not being obeyed. So when she called my cellar a dirt hole, something old and cold lit up inside me. I didn't yell, didn't argue, just looked at her until the silence started doing the work for me. Then I told her, calm as I could, that the structure predated her entire development by over a century. She waved that off like history was an inconvenience. Said covenants were covenants, safety was safety, aesthetics were aesthetics, property values were sacred. You know the type, says property values the way a preacher says salvation. The official notice came the next day, delivered by some smug teenager in a golf cart wearing an HOA polo shirt like he was serving a warrant from the Supreme Court. It was a masterpiece of fake authority. Heavy cream paper, bold serif font, legal-sounding gibberish about unapproved structures, aesthetic disharmony, vermin risk. Vermin. That cellar was tighter than most of the McMansions around it. The only pests I'd seen anywhere nearby were doing monthly compliance patrols in golf carts. They gave me 14 days to submit a demolition plan, 30 days to remove the structure. Daily fines after that, plus the special assessment for forced concrete remediation. It was so arrogant, so stupid, it almost circled back around to being funny. Almost. My first instinct was simple. March over there, staple that notice to Karen's front door, and tell her exactly where she could shove her remediation order. But that would have been emotional, and emotion is expensive. In the Army, I learned something useful. When somebody wants a frontal attack, don't give them one. Make them move where you want them. Let them overextend. Let them trip over their own certainty. So I played her game. For 3 straight days, I built the most absurdly thorough application the Architectural Review Committee had ever seen in its miserable little life. I photographed the cellar from every angle, drew up engineering diagrams, made cross-sections of the stone walls and timber framing, included a soil stability report from a local engineering firm I'd already worked with, added a pest inspection proving there were no infestations, wrote a full historical summary on the structure, construction methods, regional context, all of it. Then I bound the whole thing in a thick 3-ring binder with tabs, index, contents page, the works. It looked less like an HOA application and more like evidence for a war crimes tribunal. When I dropped it off at the clubhouse, Karen was there with 2 bored lackeys, Brenda, who always looked like she was apologizing for existing, and Gary, who wore tucked-in polos and the smug expression of a man who had never once been told to shut up soon enough. I laid that binder on the counter with a nice heavy thud. Karen stared at it like I'd set down a live grenade. "What is this?" she asked. "My application," I said. "As requested." Gary actually picked it up and grunted. That alone was worth the effort. The committee meeting the next week was exactly the farce I knew it would be. Beige room, fake smiles, posters about community spirit, all that hollow small-town dictatorship energy. My binder sat unopened in the corner. Unopened. They hadn't even pretended to read it. Karen called the whole thing an eyesore, said it didn't fit the visual harmony of the neighborhood, dismissed the engineering reports without seeing them, dismissed the history without hearing it, and denied the application like she was swatting a fly. I made her say it clearly. Made her deny it on record without reviewing the submitted materials. Gary looked nervous. Brenda looked like she wanted to crawl under the table. Karen didn't care. She liked the performance too much. 2 days later came the next letter, more aggressive, more certain, more stupid. Deadline firm. Demolition mandatory. HOA approved, contractors attached, which I'm sure was just a fancy way of saying friends of the board. That was when I stopped thinking in terms of defense and started thinking in terms of collapse. Because around then, the story cracked open in a direction I never saw coming. I started digging through the attic for old property records, hoping maybe I'd find a deed, survey, some kind of preservation note, anything useful. My grandfather saved everything. That attic was a paper graveyard, ledgers, letters, farm records, report cards, old wool blankets, half a century of carefully stacked family life. Then I found this black steamer trunk that had belonged to my great-grandfather, and inside it, buried under a bunch of brittle documents, was a folder labeled in my grandfather's handwriting. The cellar. My pulse kicked up right then. Inside were sketches, repair notes, old correspondence, and a series of letters from the late 1970s between my grandfather and a university history professor researching underground railroad routes through the Shenandoah Valley. I sat there at my dining room table reading those letters while the house went dark around me, and piece by piece, the whole thing came into focus. That root cellar wasn't just a place for potatoes and canned beans. According to the research, my family had used it as a hiding place for escaped slaves moving north. It had a name, Caldwell Station. And then, underneath the letters, I found the document that changed everything. Official National Park Service Certificate, United States Department of the Interior. National Register of Historic Places. Dated October 12, 1978. I just stared at it. My grandfather had gotten that cellar federally recognized and never once mentioned it. Not once. To him, I guess it had just been the right thing to do. Protect it, file the paper away, get back to work. To me, in that moment, it was a nuclear weapon. Because Karen Miller wasn't trying to bulldoze a weird old farm structure. She was trying to destroy a federally protected historic site. With concrete. In writing. After repeated notice. The next morning I called the Virginia State Historic Preservation Office. Got connected to a man named Arthur Vance, who sounded like he drank dust for breakfast and had been waiting all his life for a call exactly like mine. I explained the situation, and there was this long silence on the line before he finally said, "They want to do what?" Then he walked me through the legal reality, National Register protection, state implications, federal consequences, personal liability, civil penalties, criminal exposure, the whole ugly menu. Board members, management company, contractors, anybody involved. By the time I hung up, I had statutes, contacts, backup, and absolute clarity. Next call was Dave Martinez, an old Army friend, former JAG, now a lawyer with the kind of cheerful aggression you only want pointed at your enemies. The second I told him what I'd found, he laughed this beautiful disbelieving laugh and said, "Mark this as art." We didn't reveal the certificate right away. That would have let Karen retreat. Instead, Dave sent a formal letter asking for documentation, building code basis, engineering findings, pest evidence, legal justification. Every question was a trap. Every line forced them to either admit they had nothing or lie in writing. Karen, being Karen, responded herself. Not a lawyer. Her. Dismissive, arrogant, absolute. Said their first-hand observation was enough. Said their authority was not subject to appeal. Signed it with her own hand. I still smile thinking about that. By then I'd also started talking to neighbors. Arthur Abernathy, retired history teacher, sweet guy, loved the old farm. The Garcias, young couple with kids, already on Karen's hit list because of a plastic slide in the driveway. Once people started talking, the stories came pouring out. Fines over trash cans, bushes, bicycles, grass height, holiday decor, toys, everything. Then came the twist that really turned anger into revolt. Karen's brother-in-law had a no-bid landscaping contract for the whole development, charging almost double market rate. Suddenly this wasn't just about my cellar. It was harassment, power, and money. We started a private homeowners group online. People joined fast. Quietly at first, then all at once. And then deadline day came. 9 a.m, clear spring sunlight, birds chirping like this was any normal day, and here comes a giant yellow concrete truck rumbling down the street like an executioner on schedule. Behind it, Karen in a fuchsia suit, with Gary and Brenda trailing her, smug as saints in stained glass. I walked down to the property line with my binder in hand. She told me to step aside. Instead, I looked at the truck driver and said, loud enough for everybody gathering on their lawns to hear, "Sir, the structure you're about to destroy is a federally protected historic site. If you proceed, you may be participating in a felony." That stopped him cold. Karen exploded, called me a liar, a fraud, said I printed fake documents off the internet. So I opened the binder, showed the certificate, then the laws, then the highlighted sections about prison time and fines. Gary turned gray. Brenda looked nauseous. The driver physically backed away from the truck. And right when Karen's authority started cracking in public, Arthur Abernathy stepped forward from the crowd and, with that schoolteacher voice that could probably stop traffic, announced that the cellar was a landmark tied to the Underground Railroad and that our HOA president had just tried to bury local history under concrete. That was the moment the crowd turned. Karen, humiliated and cornered, did the dumbest thing possible. She called the police. The deputies showed up, listened to her breathless little performance, then listened to me. I handed over the binder. The younger deputy started flipping pages, and you could actually watch his expression change. Sergeant Miller, no relation, thankfully, looked at Karen and asked if she had ordered the concrete. She admitted it. Right there. Out loud. He told her, in front of everybody, that no crime was being committed by me, but if she proceeded, she and everyone involved could be facing serious charges. That concrete truck pulled away a few minutes later, and I swear it was one of the prettiest things I've ever seen. After that, the whole rotten thing collapsed fast. Lawsuit filed. Temporary restraining order granted. Local paper picked up the story. Then regional TV. The homeowners group exploded. Corporate management suspended Karen, Gary, and Brenda. Residents organized a recall meeting. People lined up at the microphone with years of stories, fines, threats, intimidation, shady contracts, all of it. Karen got one last chance to defend herself, and somehow made herself sound even worse. 92% voted to remove the board. Gone. Just like that. The settlement covered my legal fees, damages, and forced a formal apology in the HOA newsletter acknowledging the historical significance of Caldwell Station and the board's gross overreach. Karen and her little inner circle were barred from serving on any board under that management company again. The new board voided old fines, fired the landscaping company, and started rewriting the bylaws so nobody could ever weaponize vagueness the way Karen had. And the best part, one used part of the settlement money to do something good with it. We built a proper stone path to the cellar, installed a bronze historical marker telling the truth about the site, the family, and the people who hid there on their way to freedom. 6 months later, the whole neighborhood gathered on my lawn for the dedication. Kids running around, neighbors laughing, People actually talking to each other like human beings instead of reporting one another for visible recycling bins. Arthur stood beside me that day and said, "You know, in a strange way, we owe Karen a thank you." I laughed at first, but he was right. Her obsession with controlling one ugly little dirt hole forced the whole community to discover what it really was. Not an eyesore, not a violation, but a piece of conscience buried in the soil. She wanted conformity. She built resistance. She wanted silence. She created witnesses. She wanted concrete. She got a monument. And that's the part ones still think about. How often the people most obsessed with control end up exposing exactly why they should never have had it in the first place. So tell me this: when rules are used to crush history, bully families, and protect the powerful, is following the rules still the moral thing to do? Or does real justice start the moment somebody finally says no? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear where you stand on right, wrong, power, and payback, and if you've ever dealt with a Karen, an HOA, or any petty tyrant who pushed just a little too far, tell that story too.